Meanwhile, another major story and a live event that we are going to be covering for you here this morning. Testimony set to resume as the committee investigating the riot at the U.S. Capitol last year makes its case against former President Donald Trump. His campaign manager, Bill Stepien, is expected to testify. Questions are going to focus on the former president's effort to push claims that the election was stolen. Now, members of the committee think there is already enough evidence to consider a criminal indictment against the former president. So in order to weigh in on what we can expect today and really look back at what we already saw in that primetime hearing that took place last week, I do want to welcome onto the show Elizabeth Wydra. She is a legal analyst and president of the Constitutional Accountability Center. Elizabeth, good morning to you. Thank you so much for joining us. How are you doing?
I'm great. Good morning. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely, Elizabeth. So day two of these hearings that are going to take place over the month of June. And really today is focused on trying to prove that Trump and his allies knew that election fraud claims were false. I feel like we already were teased a little bit into the overall purpose of today. Am I right? From that first primetime hearing where we saw then Attorney General Bill Barr say that he believed that the election fraud claims were quote, BS. We also heard from a deposition that was recorded from Ivanka Trump. So really, when you talk about today's overall focus, what comes to your mind initially?
Yes, exactly. So today, what we're going to hear is that Donald Trump knew that he had lost the election. He knew it, his inner circle knew it, his lawyers knew it, and yet nonetheless, he continued to push this narrative that he had still won the election. And he took steps, as the committee laid out, to try to hold on to power, even if it meant shredding the Constitution in the process. And what the committee has done and will continue to do today, it seems, is have this story told not by the members of the committee, not by Democratic political opponents of the president, but have this story come from the mouths of Trump's inner circle themselves. So as we saw in that first hearing, the deposition of President Trump's Attorney General Bill Barr saying that the claims that he won the 2020 election were BS, but the long version, his daughter Ivanka saying that she believed Bill Barr. And then it looks like today what we will see from Trump's campaign manager, from a conservative election lawyer, from other members of this inner circle, other participants in this story, is that they knew there was no data there to show that Donald Trump won the 2020 election. They knew that there were no legal arguments to support that he won the 2020 election. And yet they continued to tell this story to Republican supporters, to the American people, and that it was a lie.
Yeah, and I think piggybacking off of what you're saying, Elizabeth, I feel like that was one of the huge revelations from that first hearing last week, is the fact that these are people that work for President Trump, former President Trump, that have a loyalty to him, but are pushing back against those election fraud claims, including his own family, his own daughter.
Exactly. And, I think that makes the evidence presented extremely powerful because, these are not kind of gleeful political opponents putting this story out there. Some of the witnesses that will be testifying today have made clear that they're there under subpoena. I can't imagine that Ivanka Trump relished being forced to admit under oath that her father had lost the election. But I think that goes to show the strength of the bipartisan effort that the committee has undertaken for nearly a year to uncover all this evidence using, nonpartisan intelligence and national security officials, former prosecutors who have gone through this evidence and, taken these depositions and held these interviews of Trump's inner circle that have made clear that they knew that he had lost the election, that Trump knew he had lost the election, and yet he continued to push this story. Even after he lost case after case after case in the courts, he continued to push this story, pumping up his supporters, raising tons and tons of money from them leading up to January 6th and the violent attempt to disrupt the constitutional peaceful transfer of power that we all witnessed on that terrible day.
Well, Elizabeth, we are all about breaking news here, and you are joining us as we are just getting word that due to a family emergency, Bill Stepien is now unable to testify before the Select Committee this morning. That has literally just come into our desk. We heard yesterday that the January 6th committee does believe that they already have enough evidence to possibly indict former President Trump. So now that we will not have this testimony, how do you think this will kind of change the overall tone and focus of today's hearing?
Yeah, I think they probably would, have liked to have his live testimony, but I have no doubt that they have recorded depositions and interviews that make much of the same points that they wanted to have live today. I do think there is some benefit in having that live testimony. Certainly there was something that was so moving about hearing Officer Caroline Edwards at that first primetime hearing talk about, the horror that she witnessed and the pain that she personally endured as an officer trying to push back against the violent crowd on January 6th. So there is something to be said for live testimony, but I don't think that really changes the actual evidence that the committee has. They have depositions. They took over 1,000 depositions and interviews as part of this painstaking process that they've gone through over the last year. So I don't think when it comes to the ultimate case they're making to the American people, and that they are making for the eyes and ears of those who might prosecute all of those who have been participants in this attack on American democracy. It's probably not ideal for them, but I don't think it really impacts the ultimate case that they are presenting.
Now, in addition to Stepien, you touched on it a little bit earlier, Elizabeth, but who are the other witnesses that we are expected to hear from, and what do you expect from their testimony necessarily?
Yeah, exactly. So first of all, I think we'll continue to have this multimedia presentation where we also hear from people through recorded testimony. But today we're going to hear from a former Fox News political editor who was involved in calling particularly the state of Arizona on election night, who I imagine will talk about, the data and the actual votes that were there on election night, and how there simply was not evidence that Donald Trump was going to win these states that he later claimed falsely were subject to election fraud. We're going to hear from the former U.S. attorney in Georgia, who I imagine will talk about the way in which former President Trump tried personally to pressure election officials in that state to find votes that simply didn't exist for him, directly trying to thwart the people's ability to choose their own leaders. We're going to hear from Ben Ginsburg, who is a conservative election lawyer, who I expect will talk about how there weren't any legal arguments to support former President Trump's claim that he had won the 2020 election. And in fact, Trump lost case after case after case in the state and federal courts trying to overturn the will of the people in the 2020 election. And we're going to hear, from others from a commissioner in Philadelphia, again, Pennsylvania, a state that was subject to this ongoing push to overturn the 2020 election, even though, as I imagine they'll show through other testimony, given that Bill Stepien will not be there apparently, even though Trump and his campaign and his inner circle knew that he had actually lost the election, and yet nonetheless continued to pressure these individuals. But I think what is going to be on the minds of the Americans who are watching this, on the committee members, on the people who participated, is accountability. And we generally get accountability at the ballot box here. And if the sanctity of the ballot box and the vote of the people is going to be put at risk, how do then we assure ourselves as Americans that there's going to be accountability?
Absolutely. And, to kind of dive deeper into that, Elizabeth, I really want to take a look back at what exactly unfolded after Election Day in 2020. After the 2020 presidential election, Trump's campaign and others filed and lost at least 63 lawsuits contesting election processes, vote counting, and the vote certification process in multiple states. And like you just mentioned, these most were in the swing states, Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, others. Do you feel that this was a strategic decision to file lawsuits in the states that were too close to call during the night of Election Day?
It certainly seems like that was the case. And the idea that by filing these lawsuits, it could prop up the other claims that the Trump team was trying to make about the 2020 election, trying to continue the lie that the vote in these states was not free and fair and secure. But as we saw in the courts, and these were not, we're not talking about super liberal judges making these decisions. Some of them were Trump appointed judges. These judges time after time said there is no there. These legal claims about the election hold no water. And so we saw time and time and again, Trump losing in the courts. But I do think that filing these lawsuits, even though they knew they were, had no merit whatsoever. And we've seen Rudy Giuliani lose his law license in New York, and there have been proceedings brought against him in DC, where he also has a bar license. He lost his ability to practice law because those lawsuits were so outlandish and frivolous. And so, I think what we saw through those court efforts was just a continuation of the ongoing conspiracy, is what the committee is calling it, to subvert the vote of the people, to overturn the vote of the people in the 2020 election.
Yeah, and Elizabeth, they are saying that today specifically is going to put forth a lot of evidence specifically to the Department of Justice, who they are hoping could possibly indict the former president. Now, when it comes to this information that is going to be forthcoming, how will this necessarily work? Does Attorney General Garland just basically take the information from these hearings and make that ultimate decision?
That is certainly the decision of the Department of Justice. And, I think what the committee can do, and what it seems like it is doing, is to lay out a roadmap of evidence that shows an ongoing criminal conspiracy and shows that Donald Trump was involved in that. But ultimately, the decision about whether to press federal criminal charges belongs to the Department of Justice, with Attorney General Garland at the head of that. But also there, are state and local prosecutors who are likely very interested. We already talked about Georgia. And so what the committee is doing by putting out this evidence is incredibly important for those who could decide whether or not to bring criminal charges or not. But I also think it's, that's sort of accountability at the jury box. But I think it's also incredibly important for accountability at the ballot box, because folks who, including potentially former President Trump himself, who were involved in this effort, remain political leaders, remain in political life. Some of them are currently running for office. Some of them, again, like President Trump, could run for office in the future. And so when we're talking about accountability, yes, there's the jury box with potential criminal charges, but there's also the continuing accountability at the ballot box. And the American people need to know that whoever they vote for, their vote is going to count and is going to control the outcome.
Yeah, definitely. And, Garland has not specified whether he would be willing to prosecute. And if he does, this would be historic, Elizabeth. I mean, no president or ex-president has ever been indicted, even with this being compared to Nixon and the Watergate scandal.
Yeah, it's hard to know what would have happened in Watergate if Nixon hadn't essentially, taken responsibility, resigned from the office of the presidency, and then kind of moved on. He didn't try to reinsert himself again. So who knows what would have happened there? But I think it's an interesting question here, because yes, we have this incredibly important principle that you don't go after political opponents because they're your political opponents. So we are very careful about that. in American democracy. And it's incredibly important that we continue that. But we also don't want to fall into the trap of not holding people accountable simply because they have held political office. So you have to, I think what Garland is trying to do is walking that line between, we don't want to stoke further political division, but at the same time, we cannot let people off the hook when they engage in serious, violent, deadly conspiracy to overturn an election. And that is a gravely important question for Merrick Garland to consider. And if the evidence is there, he has said that they will follow the facts. And simply because President Trump was a president, he still is not above the law.
And, in what we saw from Election Day 2020 to the insurrection on the Capitol on January 6th, and in the wake of the information that is forthcoming, Elizabeth, in your legal perspective, do you believe that former President Donald Trump committed crimes that are worth federal charges?
So I don't know the actual factors that Merrick Garland and his team at DOJ are going to use to determine that. I'm sure they are multifold, or what charges could be brought by the states. But I certainly think that what the committee is laying out in terms of what Donald Trump knew, what he said, what he did or did not do, certainly is damning evidence. And I think it's only going to snowball as these hearings continue. And certainly today will be a big step in that process.
Well, Elizabeth, as we prepare for this hearing to get underway very shortly, any last takeaways? What should viewers look out for? What will you be looking out for? Any last thoughts?
Yeah, I think today, as an American, I don't like being lied to by my political leaders. I don't like the idea that people will blithely disregard their oath to the Constitution. And so seeing evidence of that today, I think, is something that I'm going to look for as an American. As a legal expert, I think I'm going to look for the way in which the committee lays out its case for showing that President Trump and his allies knew that they had lost the election and yet acted both with respect to the public, with respect to fundraising, with respect to the courts, as if they thought that there were actually claims that were legitimate, that they had won, when they knew, in fact, that they had not. So I think this will be another interesting day, and the committee will, again, do the storytelling through the mouths of Trump's inner circle and allies themselves, which I think is something that will be very powerful and interesting to watch.
Definitely. Well, Elizabeth, we really appreciate you joining us here on the show to kind of break down everything we could potentially see. We even got some breaking news while you were with us. So Elizabeth Wydra, a legal analyst and president of the Constitutional Accountability Center, we really appreciate your insight, and we'll definitely be chatting with you again soon. Thank you so much.